In this afternoon's session, this session and the corresponding session tomorrow afternoon, we're going to move into the compassion wing of the practice, so to provide a little bit of balance for the Vipashyana. Because often when people go into the Vipashyana practice in sort of quite extensively, often they become very absorbed in the Vipashyana practice and sort of forget about the compassion wing of the practice. And then often we end up, our Vipashyana practice ends up not in a very good place, because what can happen is that Vipashyana practice can really get us into a very self-absorbed state. We can get quite disconnected from the world and often even become insensitive to the sufferings of others. And then in very extreme cases, people who engage in a lot of Vipassana practice often then come up with this idea that because they're doing Vipassana practice, everything they do is with wisdom, so therefore everything I do is okay. So often they end up doing quite a lot of unethical behavior in the name of Vipassana, supposedly. So we want to be careful we don't sort of end up there with our Vipassana practice. We need to have it balanced with the compassion wing of practice, particularly to keep our motivation in line, and then also provides a lot of positive energy for the Vipassana practice as well. So last week in the shamatha practice we did similarly, we looked at the compassion wing of the practice, and there we looked at two practices which are part of what's called the four immeasurables. These are four qualities in the compassion wing of practice that we're trying to cultivate. And the word immeasurable here means we're cultivating these qualities towards immeasurable living beings, meaning to all living beings. And the two practices and qualities we looked at last week were the first one was loving kindness, which is a translation of the original Sanskrit word Maitri and the Pali word metta. Maitri and metta are simply defined as the wish for ourselves and others to be happy, or in other words, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Very similar to this is the practice of compassion. In Sanskrit and Pali is karuna, and compassion is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So loving kindness is looking at the perspective of welfare in terms of happiness. Compassion is looking at in terms of welfare in terms of freedom from suffering. With both of these qualities, it's recommended that we develop them in stages. So normally in the meditation texts, they say first cultivate loving kindness and compassion to those people close to you because it's most easy. Then start to move out to cultivating these qualities towards people we don't know very well. And then slowly start going out to cultivating towards people we find a bit difficult and challenging, and then eventually to all living beings. But I think in our modern society, we need to add one more step to this that's normally not talked about so much in the texts, and that is to first begin by cultivating loving kindness and compassion toward ourselves, because unfortunately in our modern society seems to be an epidemic of low self-esteem and even self-hatred. So if we're not kind and compassionate toward ourselves, we're not going to be able to extend that out to others. So often then it's very helpful, particularly if we do suffer from low self-esteem and don't feel good about ourselves, to first cultivate loving kindness and compassion towards ourselves, then slowly expand it out to others. So those were the two qualities and practices we looked at last week. There are two more here in the four immeasurables. This third one is empathetic joy, or in Sanskrit and Pali, mudita. And empathetic joy is defined as the wish for ourselves and others to never be separated from our happiness. In other words, it's a rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. And I think this also is something very important, particularly in our modern society, because in our modern society, we always seem to focus on the negative with respect to self and others. And we therefore end up with a very biased, unbalanced view of ourselves and others. We tend to identify ourselves and others solely with our negative habits, negative thoughts, negative behavior. So we end up with a completely imbalanced view. So here, of course, empathetic joy is focusing on the positive aspects of ourselves and others and rejoicing in those positive aspects. Also, this is very helpful for overcoming jealousy, because often when we see other people having something good, we tend to get jealous. So this is an antidote to jealousy. Instead of being jealous, we're happy for them and rejoice in their good fortune and their good behavior. So this, I think, is very important in our modern society. And then the last point is equanimity, or upeksha, in Pali, upekha. So equanimity is developing an impartial attitude towards others. Now, of course, we tend to have a very biased attitude towards others. And often we have an attitude towards others from the perspective of how are these people affecting me? And so based on that perspective, we tend to categorize people into one of three groups, depending on how they affect us. To those people around us who seem to support me in my happiness, we label friend. Those people around us who don't seem to affect me in my happiness in any way, stranger. And those people around us who seem to interfere with me in my happiness, maybe even seem to cause me suffering, the so-called enemy. So we divide people into these three groups primarily from the perspective of how are they affecting us. Once we've done that division, then of course, our attitude becomes very biased, because to the group we've labeled friend because they seem to be the source of our happiness, we have a lot of craving and attachment towards them. To the group we've labeled stranger because they don't seem to be affecting me and my happiness in any way, we often become very apathetic and indifferent towards them. And then to the group that we've labeled the so-called enemy because they seem to be interfering with me and my happiness, we often have a lot of aversion, hostility, anger, and hatred. So we have attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger, and hatred to difficult people. So equanimity is about overcoming this biased attitude. And we can do that by reflecting on the fact that we're all stuck in the same situation. We're all struggling to be happy. We're all struggling to be free of suffering. So therefore, we can get a sense of closeness to everyone, that we're all in that similar situation. So this is what equanimity is about having that sense of closeness to everyone, connection to everyone, understanding this fact, and not simply to have attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger, and hatred to difficult people. So it's this mind of equanimity that actually allows all the other three qualities to expand out towards all living beings. What we're going to do now as a meditation is we're going to do a meditation that is very widely practiced in the Mahayana tradition, particularly in the Tibetan tradition. And it's a meditation practice called Tonglen. Tonglen is a Tibetan word, and that means literally giving and taking. And in the Tonglen practice, we are imagining taking on the suffering of others, and we're imagining giving our happiness away to them. And this is a very powerful method, because normally we have quite a selfish attitude. We have what's called self-cherishing. We put our happiness ahead of everyone else. And so that self-cherishing attitude actually creates a lot of suffering for us and for the people around us. So by doing this Tonglen practice, it directly challenges this self-cherishing. Because the last thing the self-cherishing mind would want to do would be to take on any suffering from anybody. And the last thing the selfish, self-cherishing mind would want to do would be to give away any happiness to anyone. So by imagining doing this, it really reduces this selfish mind and instead transforms that into a mind of cherishing others. And so instead of course, having attachment and aversion, that process transforms that attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. So it's a very powerful practice. And with the Tonglen practice, as with the loving kindness and compassion practice, it's recommended that we do this practice in stages. That first we do this Tonglen practice with respect to people close to us because it's most easy, then slowly expand that out to people we don't know very well, then out to people we find a bit difficult, and then towards all living beings. But again, I think in our modern society, often we need to begin one step at the beginning, ourselves. So therefore, it's often recommended to begin this Tonglen practice, particularly again, if we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves, low self-esteem, to use this, or have very strong self-cherishing, then to use this Tonglen practice for ourselves first, toward ourselves, and then slowly expand it out to others. So we're going to be doing the Tonglen practice today and the session after lunch tomorrow. So what I'd like to do today is to start by using this Tonglen practice to cultivate loving kindness and compassion to ourselves, and then move it out to someone close to us, most easy. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll start to expand that out further. So that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to do a meditation. I won't explain the Tonglen. One thing I will explain is that the Tonglen practice is often best done in conjunction with the breath, because then it helps us to keep focused. So what we're going to be doing in this practice is we're going to, on the in-breath, we're going to be imagine taking in the suffering, and on the out-breath, imagine giving the happiness. But the mechanism of what we're doing, self-explanatory, and I'll leave that in the meditation. It's quite straightforward to follow. So we'll do that meditation, and then there's a few more points I want to talk about the meditation after, and then there's a few more helpful points about the four immeasurables that I want to comment on as well. But that's after the meditation. So let's first do the meditation, and then we'll have that discussion after. As an act of loving kindness for yourself, allow your awareness to descend into the body, simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. and relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Simply focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Glen is a Tibetan word which means giving and taking. It's a very powerful practice to transform our ordinary selfish, self-cherishing mind into a mind of cherishing others, or transforming our attachment and aversions into loving kindness and compassion. And we can begin by using the Tonglen practice to cultivate loving kindness and compassion toward ourselves. No matter how much mental afflictions are in our mind, no matter how much craving and attachment, jealousy, anger, fear, no matter how much these sorts of mental afflictions are in our mind, they are merely like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And underneath these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our mind. This natural purity of mind is often called Buddha nature, our potential to reach the highest goals imaginable. So imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest, at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes? May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then imagine all your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. And then imagine that the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now you're free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And simply rest in that inner purity of mind. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine immeasurable rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart, filling and saturating your entire body and mind, and transforming into everything you need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to yourself whatever you need to be happy. And then imagine that you've now found the genuine happiness that you seek. And simply rest in that state of inner well-being. And just as you wish to be happy and to be free of suffering, so does everyone else. So now bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And picture them very clearly in front of you. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And then imagine their problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. Then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished, and now they're completely free of that problem or suffering. And take delight in this. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness and its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine immeasurable rays of light radiating out from your heart, filling their entire body and mind, and transforming into everything they need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. And then imagine that they've now found the happiness that is their heart's desire. And take delight in this. And then release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest. Simply resting in awareness itself. Simply being aware of being aware. Resting in luminously clear awareness. When this practice is explained and then people engage in this practice, sometimes there's a few doubts or even concerns come up about the practice. And one of the most common is that, that if people think like, if we're doing this with someone who has some sort of serious illness, and I imagine taking this on from them, maybe I'll get sick, so I don't really want to do that. Remember, this is a mental exercise. So we can't actually take anyone's sickness from them. What we're doing, of course, is developing our willingness to do that, to reduce our self-cherishing and to really increase our mind of cherishing others. So actually the main beneficiary of this practice is yourself, because it's primarily for the purpose of reducing your self-cherishing mind and increase the mind of cherishing others, increasing your loving kindness and compassion. But of course, that doesn't mean other people don't benefit. Of course, they'll benefit, because by doing this practice, means that you'll be helping others in a more genuine way. Because even now when we help people, our friends and so forth, often we help them with our own agenda, our own motivation. You know, I know what's best, you need to do this, rather than really focusing on that person's welfare, where often it's sort of a little bit selfish motivation. We have our own agenda. And also, of course, then by doing this practice, we'll start to help people who we normally don't really help. So we'll find we'll be helping more people with our loving kindness and compassion. But also, what we need to understand from this practice is that, you know, when it's explained that we can't directly take anyone's suffering from them, then often people go, well, what's the point in the practice? Again, the main point of the practice is what I've just explained. The main point is to reduce our selfish motivation, to increase the mind of cherishing others, so that we can actually then in daily life help others in a more genuine way. But also, there is, I think, can be a direct benefit for the other person in this practice. And I think some modern studies have shown this as well, is that we, through the power of our own mind, can affect the minds of others in a positive way, particularly if we have some connection with that person. And I think, again, some modern studies have shown that this is possible, even if the other person's on the other side of the planet. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of the mind. So by doing this practice sincerely, we could have a very positive impact on that person's mind without them even being aware of us doing the practice. And actually, unfortunately, modern studies have also shown that if we do this sort of practice, or we simply pray for someone who's sick and we tell them we're doing that for them, it actually has a slight negative impact. That's very unfortunate, but modern studies show this. And I think it's because the other person feels like somehow they're under pressure then or something to get better. Whatever the reason, studies show that if you tell people that you're praying for them or whatever, in general, it actually has a slight negative impact. So the best thing to do is to pray or do this practice for people and without telling them. And also, of course, if you're doing this practice for others and you're telling them, it can be a bit of a sign of the ego, the self-cherishing. I'm doing this for you, you know. So if you're not telling them, then it's better for the self-cherishing to reduce it, because you're doing it anonymously. So for these reasons, I think it's best to just do this without really telling people. So this is a little bit some of the doubts that come up with this practice. But this practice is something that is widely practiced in the Tibetan tradition. Does anyone have any questions about this practice? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not necessarily referring to what most people consider tough love. But when somebody is doing something very bad to you, sometimes the only way to be good to yourself is to either cut them out. I mean, that feeling, or, you know, if you want to treat yourself well, is not to put yourself in that being subjected to that person's cruelty.
Correct.
So then, how do you find that right ground, that middle ground of saying, you know, this person's so bad for me that, I don't know, I'm not necessarily talking about revenge, but
sure.
You know, you don't, it could hurt you to expend so much loving kindness towards them, and it might be healthier for you to say, you know, you're a cancer to me, I'm going to cut you out.
Right.
How do you find that?
Right. So here the thing is, and this is where people struggle and have difficulties when we talk about having loving kindness and compassion to others, is that often people leave out the wisdom part, and then they have difficulties, because we need to be really effective in anything we do. We need to have both components of wisdom and compassion, or loving kindness in this case, together in everything we do. Because also what can happen, similar to what you've described, is we want to help people, we're compassionate to people, and then they take advantage of us. But then often what happens is in that case, and in the case you've mentioned, we get hurt, and then people think, oh, this loving kindness and compassion thing doesn't work, so let's not do that anymore because we're suffering. But actually, it's not that loving kindness or compassion creates suffering for us. It's the lack of wisdom which creates the suffering for us. So therefore, we should make sure that in everything we do with loving kindness and compassion, we need to bring in the wisdom. And that wisdom in these difficult situations often is called tough love. You know, this is what tough love is. Tough love is, and same with tough compassion. For example, if we're trying to help someone and then they take advantage of us and we let them, that's not very compassionate because we're encouraging them to behave badly. So that's actually not loving kindness and compassion. If we're really kind and compassionate, we would not allow that to happen. To be really very forceful about that behavior and say that behavior is completely unacceptable, I will not accept that. But people find that very difficult to do because often, and this came up in the shamatha retreat, is that we often identify the person with their behavior. So if someone's behaving badly, we see them as a bad person. So rather than being very forceful about the behavior and still being compassionate to the person, we simply end up attacking the person. And so that's not helpful. So tough love is not attacking the person if they're behaving badly. Tough love is being very kind and compassionate to the person and not accepting their bad behavior, being very forceful about that. And if it's, as your example suggested, if it's in a situation where it's dysfunctional, then maybe one part of wisdom is to get out of that situation if we can't deal with it effectively. But we can do that without attacking the person. So this is really what tough love or tough compassion is about, is still having that kindness and compassion for the person, but dealing with that negative behavior in a very forceful way.
But what if that negative behavior is relentless?
Then, like I said, maybe we need to get out of that situation. Like if it's a abusive relationship, because again, we can't change people. All we can do is try to have the best positive impact on others. That's all we can do. There's no guarantee that we can improve that person's behavior. We can't do that. So if that person, through our efforts, our constant effort, is not improving their behavior, and that behavior is having a detrimental impact on us and them, then the last solution is to cut from that situation.
What if that still leaves you at a, for lack of a better word, a net loss?
Net loss.
Meaning somehow that revenge isn't the word, but if somehow just getting out of it is a form of accepting it.
Yeah.
Because you're not stopping it. Let's say.
No. Well, you can't stop other people's behavior. You can't. If you expect that, you're never going to be able to do that. And that's not correct. I mean.
But sometimes, for example, a bully needs to be stood up to.
Correct, with compassion. And there's a very great video on the internet where there's this teacher who has all the school children in the auditorium, and he does exactly this with compassion. And it really works. It really works. Or it's more, put it this way, it's much more likely to work than the other approach of attacking the person. That's much less likely to have a positive impact. Of course, there's no guarantee that you're going to stop that bullying behavior, but the best chance that you have is with this, what's called wrathful compassion, rather than attacking the person. See, that's the thing, is that often people feel compassion is weak, has no strength. But that's not real compassion. Real compassion is always with wisdom. Anger is a sign of weakness. Compassion is a sign of strength. And compassion can be very forceful with the behavior, not attacking the person. So we have to distinguish that, otherwise it just turns into anger, and that doesn't work. But this is what people fail to understand is, and often it's because they stick the person and the behavior together And then when they do that, then it's difficult because we want to reject the behavior. But if we've identified the person with the behavior, rejecting the behavior usually translates into attacking the person, getting angry at the person. Yeah. Or if we don't want to do that, then compassion, trying to do compassion, turns into submission. So both accepting their negative behavior, submitting, and attacking the person, both are the extremes we're trying to avoid. And the way to avoid it is don't identify the person with their behavior, distinguish them, then we can have very strong compassion for the person and at the same time have very forceful a way of dealing with their behavior, not accepting that behavior.
What if you see this person hurting a lot of other people, not just yourself, and you feel you need to somehow combat that to help all the other people?
Correct.
As well?
And that's what we need to do in our society. But unfortunately, in our society, we tend to identify the person with the behavior. And so if we see someone in society harming society, we grab them, we stick them in jail, and we punish the person. And statistics show they usually come out worse. Whereas without identifying the person with the behavior, if they're in society being very harmful, we need to take them out of society and then try to rehabilitate that person with compassion. No guarantee we'll correct it, but better chance than rather than attacking. So we tend to, in our judicial system, we tend to punish people instead of punishing the behavior. If we punish the behavior and have compassion for the person, we've got the best chance of improving. No guarantee, of course, because we can't make a person anyway. But that's the best chance we've got, I think. So we need to understand that, and this is the key here, is compassion and loving kindness has to come with wisdom. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, these things happen. People walk over the top of us, or we end up attacking the person. And that doesn't, it's not helpful for us or for them.
But even in an extreme case, you see, for instance, all this violence going on, and sometimes the only answer is to shoot the killer.
Oh, in the very last resort. I mean, there's usually other options before that.
But if you don't act decisively, sometimes that other person could create a lot more damage.
Right. And what happens, of course, is that people in those situations often go in without compassion or wisdom. They kill the person, and that generates just more extremists. And that's what we see in the world today. Oh, we have to act decisively. We have to go and wipe them out. What does that do? It just creates more. And that's, you know, the war on terrorism. That's all it's done. It's created more terrorists. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So we need and that's the solution, is to not do that, to find ways of stopping those people, and with using loving kindness and compassion. Because the reason these people are there in the first place is because of hatred and anger. That's why they're there. The way to defeat the enemy is to make them a friend. That's the only solution. Anything else just is a mess. Of course, it's not easy, but that's what we should be doing.
Well, that's an extreme example.
Yeah, of course. And of course, if someone is in the point of about to kill you, you should try and defend yourself. But usually there's a lot of things we can do before it gets to that situation. Okay. Oh, is there any other questions? Sorry. There was something I wanted to present here. Okay. Now, with these four immeasurables, each one of them has something that looks like it, but actually it's not. It's sort of the opposite. So each one has what's called the far enemy, which is what is directly opposite to this, like loving kindness, you know, like hatred. So that's obvious that that is the enemy, the opposite. But each one also, unfortunately, has something which is called the near enemy, something which seems to be this, but actually is not and creates problems. So it's important that for each one of these, we can identify the near enemy and get rid of it. Fortunately, each one of these, one of the other four immeasurables, can help work to subdue that near enemy. So, of course, the near enemy for loving kindness is attachment. We talked a lot about those differences last week in the retreat. So loving kindness, of course, in a relationship is focusing on the other person. May you be happy. I want you to be happy. Whereas attachment in a relationship is saying, I want you to make me happy. So attachment's all about me, 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 me. So it seems like in that dynamic, there's just one thing going on, but actually often there's both. So we need to identify this near enemy attachment and reduce that as much as possible. Otherwise, it will corrupt and pollute loving kindness. Fortunately, there's a way of doing that, and that is to reflect on equanimity. So by reflecting on equanimity, of course, we're overcoming attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger, and hatred. So if you find attachment creeping into loving kindness, equanimity is a good antidote. The near enemy of equanimity is indifference. Because equanimity is this equal attitude towards others. Actually, it's this sense of closeness to everyone. But that can degenerate into indifference. We're equally indifferent to everyone. So we need to be able to see that our equanimity is degenerating into indifference. Fortunately, a way to overcome indifference is reflecting on compassion. Because it's very hard to be indifferent when we see others suffering. So by reflecting on compassion, that will overcome indifference. But then sometimes compassion can degenerate into this sort of desperation, this despair, because we're always seeing all this suffering, suffering, suffering. So we can end up in a sort of state of despair. So the antidote to that, of course, is to reflect on empathetic joy, which is focusing on the positive aspects of ourselves and others. So empathetic joy, of course, is rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good deeds. But sometimes this rejoicing can become very meaningless, and even rejoicing about harmful things. So if this rejoicing, this empathetic joy, becomes very frivolous and meaningless, or even rejoicing in in harmful things, then to reflect on loving kindness, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes, to really make sure that we're rejoicing in that direction. So each one of these then helps to support each other in terms of the near enemy. Any questions about that?
I find it a little difficult to understand how the near enemy of rejoicing. How can it develop into this? I can see, of course, rejoicing in bad things. That's not a good thing. But you also said something else. You said
like meaningless rejoicing.
Yeah, meaningless. What are we talking about here?
Well, just being happy. Just rejoicing in
Oh, meaningless things.
Like mundane, very meaning.
Okay.
Like,
I understand.
Oh, I've got I got a lot of money. I'm happy. Okay. All this stuff that really doesn't really bring us anything.
So you need to find
make sure that our rejoicing is rejoicing for a good direction and not a meaningless one. And so to overcome that is to reflect on loving kindness, which is reflecting on happiness and its causes.
Yeah, exactly. So we come back to Dharma, actually.
Yeah. So each one of these, of course, near enemy is sort of based on our mental afflictions. Yeah.
Okay.
Attachment is a mental affliction, and then these indifference, and these are all based on mental afflictions. And so we're using one of the four immeasurables to really avoid that contamination, to keep each one of those healthy.
Good. Yeah. Thank you very much. And is there someone here who's really good at English? Maybe you, Joseph. Do you have a Danish word for equanimity?
1 second. Translating.
It's impartiality.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
unbiased.
Ligeværdighed.
Yeah,
ligeværdigt, ja.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Ligeværdigt, det
balance.
I
don't really think we have one that covers. I just wanted maybe we have talked about it before, but I thought maybe there was the
general title I work with is also acceptance. With equanimity is equal acceptance of others than myself.
Yeah, acceptance has a little different flavor. I mean, equanimity is this
harmony, some kind of harmony.
Well, harmony, yeah. Equanimity is just really putting everyone on our own level. Yeah. We're all in the same boat. Yeah. We're all and have that sense of closeness to everyone.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of difficulties to understand the difference between equanimity and indifference.
Yeah. Well, see, the thing is, when we're faced with stimulus, often we don't know how to deal with it. So either we get caught up in it or we cut from it. So, with all these people around us, often things are too overwhelming. So we just cut from everything. And so indifference is like this blank state where we're not responding to stimulus.
Right.
We don't care about anyone, because so that's the difference. Equanimity is caring, and indifference is don't care at all. Whereas normally we sort of do care, but not in a very good way, because we care about friends in terms of attachment. We care about the enemy in terms of I don't like them and aversion, and then the other one's apathetic. So usually the indifference comes only to the people who don't create some stimulus for us, don't affect us in any way. But then on top of that, for the others, if we can't deal with it, we can cut, and then we can get into the state where even friends and hostile people, their stimulus, we just don't react. We don't even acknowledge. We just couldn't care less about anyone. And usually that's comes from overload, where we can't deal with things, we shut down. So when we shut down, that's when indifference usually kicks in.
I have a related question. I mean, we hear about these people who are studying Buddhism, and then they close them in a cave for a year or two. How do you? Isn't that kind of trying to cut yourself out?
It depends on your motivation. Of course, we can have a motivation. All of this is too much. I'm going to run away and hide in a cave for the rest of my life. So that would be cutting. But of course, hopefully that's not the reason Buddhist practitioners go and meditate for a year or 2 or 3. The idea is this sort of balance between inner development and outward expression, help. I mean, the example I use here to talk about this is I say, you know, maybe we have a desire to go out and heal the world. So now, of course, we can rush out and do what we can, put bandages on people or whatever. Or we could run away for 6 years to go to medical school where we're not really helping much.
Right.
But the motivation is to develop ourselves so we can go out and help more effectively. So ideally, that should be the motivation of anyone who wants to go into 1, 2, 3 year retreat. So it's like medical school, they can train themselves so then they go back out and they're much more effective.
That's kind of a thing that I'm
sure.
I think many other people also struggling with.
Of course.
We are in a daily lives, we are in a let's say in a profession that we are actually not doing anything to help people. We're only helping ourselves, or that we are making money for the company, and then you start to think maybe I should do something else to be able to help other people, and then you think like, oh, but then I'm running out, I'm running away, I'm escaping, and that's a struggle.
So no, again, it's just a matter of balance. Of course, we're not suggesting that everyone should go away to medical school for 6 years to study medicine to be able to help the world. Of course, there are many ways of doing that. Similarly, in Buddhism, it's not like if you're a Buddhist, you have to go off in 3-year retreat or whatever. There are many options, but we need to emphasize, of course, inner development and outward expression and help. How that balance comes about will depend on us as an individual, what our talents are, what our capacity is, and from different periods of the life. Some periods of our life, we're more outward. Other periods, we're more inward, depending on what we need to work on and emphasize. So there's no fixed thing. It depends on the individual. So how to strike that balance, of course, is a challenge. And that's where a qualified teacher can be very helpful in helping to strike that balance. So that period of inner development, of course, you could use that as a way of running away, but then it's not really inner development. You're just escaping. So, you know, of course you can do that, but then it's not inner development, it's just escaping. Inner development is really giving yourself time to work on yourself so you can be more effective. That could take the form of a longer retreat. It could take the form of 1 day a week you spend time with yourself, or even half a day a week. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to spend a long period of time away. Maybe, like I said, take 1 day a week to do that work, and that could be maybe enough for you. So there's nothing that says you have to go away for 3 years or something. No. Maybe for some people that's the best, but I think for many people it's probably not the best option. Certainly not now, you know. Because we're all different.
Just going back to equanimity. Mm-hmm. Is it not in fact a process of coming to terms with all aspects of human nature which are representative within myself and I'm learning to recognize in others?
What do you mean?
So the people capable of blowing themselves up, creating such harmful actions, instead of saying, how could anybody do this? How could they be in such a situation?
Right.
In fact, I could recognize those qualities within myself and say, I could actually identify with this person because I have that same nature. I have that same human instincts and behavior, and I can identify with their desperation.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, in a very simple way, you can relate to others because we all have the same basic desire for happiness and be freedom from suffering, and we all have mental afflictions in our mind. You know, we're all contaminated by different sorts of mental afflictions. How they manifest is vastly different, but we're all stuck in that state, and so we're all the same in that way. Again, you know, some people have more anger, some more jealousy, craving. I mean, different variations, but it's essentially the same. We're all got these mental afflictions in our mind, and then they can manifest in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
So we're all equal at that level of having this contaminated mind, struggling to be happy, struggling to be free of suffering. We're all equal there.
So recognizing that
Yeah.
is also
So as often as His Holiness Dalai Lama says, we should emphasize similarities than difference.
Yeah.
The ways in which we are similar. Because emphasizing differences is what causes wars and conflict. You know, oh, your skin's a different color. Oh, you have a different religion. Oh, no, that's not good. Whereas we're all human. We all want to be happy. We all want to be free of suffering. You know, we all have mental afflictions. We all live on one planet. You know,
so promoting understanding rather than condemnation.
yeah, understanding and similarity.
Yeah, if we condemn someone saying they're not like us.
Yeah, well, exactly. Okay, let's stop there. Take a break, 15-minute break, and then we'll come back for the next session. We'll go back to the Vipashyana practice. I want to do one last meditation in terms of the Theravada Vipassana, in terms of this no self, a little bit different approach to working with the idea of no self, and then we'll move into the Mahayana Vipassana after that, the idea of emptiness. But first, a tea break, so 15-minute break.